Hello, welcome this afternoon. I hope you liked lunch. I did. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about Xdebug 3.0, but that's a little bit of a lie. Mostly because I was a little bit more optimistic at the start of the year and thought I'd actually something finished. I have not. That, however, does not mean I can't have a presentation about it, because there are many things that you might be aware of, that I'm aware of, that needs improvement in Xdebug. So I'm going to show you a little bit what all these different things are and where I want to end up at sort of the end of the year. Does that make sense? If you have any questions throughout, please let me know. I think we have a mic here. I'm not sure how we're going to sort it out. We will find a way of doing that. That's a very big camera. I brought mine too, but that'd be unfair, right? All right, so let's get going. Hi, let's try turning that on. Hi, I'm Derick. I don't have a slide about myself, because who needs a slide about himself? I'm the author of Xdebug. I also do other things. I work on other PHP things, the datetime extension, for example. And tomorrow I'll be giving a workshop about how to make tiny changes to PHP itself in the PHP Deep Dive workshop. But I'd like to get straight going here. So Xdebug, it's 17 years old. It is nearly old enough to drink. They'll have to wait until next year. And as you might be aware, any code base that is anything more than, well, I was going to say a year, but basically everything older than a month has code in there that is not as you would write it now, right? I mean, if you look at code base that is 5 years old, you were thinking, which person wrote this nonsense? And then you find out that it's actually you. Well, Xdebug has 17 years of this. And over those 17 years, it has developed quite a lot of both usability problems as well as internal issues. So a few of these things, and I'll go through all these points and then also come up with a way of addressing all of these points as well. So that's what I want to get at. So the amount of configuration options. How many configuration options do you use in Xdebug? How many do you think you know of? 3, 4, 5 maybe? Something like that, right? Well, there's 65 of them. And they're all very nicely documented, but then again, developers don't read documentation, including myself. So there's lots of pointless and duplicated ones, and as you just probably show me, you don't remember which ones they are. I sometimes don't even remember which ones they are. There's other issues. Anybody who uses PHP, FPM, and Xdebug together probably knows that they both like to use the same port number. It is sometimes difficult to debug the debugger when it tries to talk to your IDE to do any sort of debugging in PHP applications. There's quite a lot of information lacking in people that don't realize how the communication protocol actually works. And that sometimes makes it very difficult to figure out what's going on, especially when you start introducing like different networks with Docker and Vagrant, because they all make this networking quite a bit harder. And although Xdebug would be able to handle all these things fine, the problem is usually the connections between Xdebug and your IDE. There's also a bit of poor performance. I'll have some nice quotes on Twitter from that in a moment. And Xdebug is usually lagging quite behind, right? I mean, how many of you are here on PHP 7.3 running that in production? Okay, should be more, hopefully in another month's time. But some people wait adopting newer versions of PHP because Xdebug isn't ready. And for the PHP 7.3 release, it took about 4 months after PHP 7.3 was released before Xdebug was ready. And that is, of course, not great, because that stops people from adopting newer versions of PHP. But you need to be able to check whether everything works. So what do we do about all these things? Well, let's first have a look at all the configuration options. And there's a whole bunch of... I removed the Xdebug keyword in front because it's the same everywhere. So that's fine. So let's have a look at this. Any idea what Xdebug extended info does? Nope? Nobody wants to guess? It is a setting that forces PHP to create its internal structures in an extended format. And that extended format is required to be able to do single-step debugging. If you want to do step debugging, PHP needs to insert certain instructions for the virtual machine so that it can stop on these specific instructions. And I'll have a slide later to show you exactly what it does. But that setting on its own is pretty pointless, because when do you want to turn this off? Well, never, unless you run in production. So why do I have this setting, right? So that's going to go away. The same thing here, the remote handler. In early versions of Xdebug, it was possible that the protocol would speak to IDEs. There were many different variants of it. How many are there now? Just one. So why do I have the setting? And so on and so on. Other things that are conflicting, like you can turn on code coverage support in Xdebug by turning on coverage enable. There's a setting to turn on the profiler, a setting to turn on the step debugger. But these things, you should never have more than one of at the same time, because why do you want to profile when you're also doing instrumentation for code coverage? Or why would you want to profile when you are single-step debugging? Your profile is going to be absolutely useless, right? Because it's waiting for you to click next in your IDE. So this is not good usability, and this is in many cases this is somewhere some criticism comes from well, Xdebug is being slow if I do code, or if I'm doing the profiler, because code coverage is still turned on, because that's turned on by default. Not sure what happened there. Of course, it's an untrusted connection. So yeah, these things conflict, and then there's the ones in green that do sort of the same thing, right? They are both settings to configure a little bit of, in this case, a directory where Xdebug would show its output. Why do I need 3 different ones, right? Just make it one. Makes it easier, fewer configuration settings, less of an issue. There's a few more examples, but I'll get to back that later as well. All right, so the main thing that I hear often from the people that write PHPStorm, the editor, show of hands, who's not using PHPStorm here? This question 5 years ago was a very different answer. So there were three hands. What are you using? Sorry, one more time. NetBeans? NetBeans and Zen Studio. Oh, that's a rare one. That's a rare one. Most people tend to use Xdebug with PHPStorm. It's sort of gotten the de facto way of doing it. However, that doesn't mean that other IDEs support Xdebug as well, right? The protocol is actually developed with developers of Komodo. Any of you have ever heard of Komodo? It used to be very popular 10, 15 years ago, something like that. In any case, sometimes when you have a bit of code, you set a breakpoint, you press run, and it doesn't stop. Like what I'm doing here. It's like, so I set a breakpoint on line 4, I then run the code, and then it doesn't stop. That's a demo. See what happens there. Yeah, video good? Okay. Perfect. Now I need to remember. All right, so this is the wrong file. I put it in presentation mode, but why doesn't it have a shortcut for presentation mode? This is the one I was looking. Presentation mode. So we have this code here on the screen. And when I run this code, I need to make sure that I do that with the right version of PHP. If I run this code, for example, so you see that I've set a breakpoint here. And of course, I have not offered up anything to the demo goals yet. Okay, so it stops on the first line as expected with the blue line. Then I press next, and then nothing happened, right? So why is that? Why would that be? It's sort of the correct behavior, but it's the unexpected behavior, right? So what happens, oops, that's the wrong one. So what actually happens here is that if you look at what PHP generates, I've done the demo, it generates internally something what the following is. If you want to know more of how this virtual engine works, come to the workshop tomorrow. But if you look at the lines of code here, so they're numbered 1 to 13 here, and the lines here are 2, 5, 6, 7, 9, and 11, right? You remember that I mentioned the extended info statement from one of the configuration slides? That is what generates this Ext SDMT. So what can happen, the debugger can only stop on these lines that have this opcode on there, which in this case is line 5 and line 9 and line 11. you see that the breakpoint I set on line 4 doesn't have this X statement on here, so it can't stop. And because it doesn't match at all, it just continues running. This is very annoying. So a solution needs to be found for that at some point. Right, so the other thing is we have the problem of the port number that is being duplicated. So what Xdebug uses is DBGP. That's the name of the protocol. It stands for Debugging Protocol. At one time, Xdebug had a GDB. There was a DBGP protocol, a GDB protocol, and they were also implemented by DBG. Try saying that lots of times. I have practice on that one. But in any case, the problem here is that this port 9000 used by DBGP, the protocol that Xdebug uses for communicating with IDs, is also used by PHP FPM. Now, I'm not sure why PHP FPM picked the same number as Xdebug. Xdebug has been using it for 5 years longer, at least, as far as I understand. But this is annoying, right? Because everybody that uses PHP FPM either needs to change it on PHP FPM or on Xdebug. So at some point, I think I want to change this to a different number. And then maybe actually register the port number so that I have an official one instead of an unofficial one, to make sure that nobody else then gets in the way. At least I can tell them, it's mine, go away. All right, so yeah, PHP FPM picked the same one. So the debugging itself is quite complicated. So in most cases, people expect that the IDE connects to PHP with Xdebug loaded for initiating the debugging connection. That is not the case. It is Xdebug that needs to connect to the IDE to start a debugging connection. Now this is a little bit small. I'll make that a bit bigger. I know that also makes my title a bit bigger, but we'll fix that in a moment. So you have the IDE on the left-hand side and a PHP running with Xdebug on the right-hand side. Sorry, my graphics are awful. I'm a software engineer, not a designer. But this is your web server, right? Web server has port 80 open, and its IP address in this case is 10.0.1.2. I had to pick some number. So what happens if a connection gets made? Well, usually from your IDE you can click the start button or go to a browser window to start a debugging connection, right? So what happens here is that in this case, what you need to configure on Xdebug side as well, you need to know where the IDE is at, because Xdebug needs to make a connection to the IDE on a specific port. So what you need to set is this remote host argument, which is the IP address of the IDE that you're connecting to. Now, when you do that, you need to set a port. Don't pick the same one as PHP FPM uses. And by default is 9000. So the IDE now needs to start listening on this port. That is in PHPStorm the wait for incoming debugging connections thing. I think that's what the name is. And then when that happens, only then, when an HTTP request gets made to port 80, Xdebug sees whether the cookie is enabled or some get parameters that says, oh, this user wants to start debugging the request. It then makes a DBGP connect to the IDE. Then they start doing the communicating, all the breakpoints and stuff, all the you clicking yes and no and go further and step in. And then at the end, the HTTP response gets back to the same machine, right? That is this simple, basic way of doing it. However, it does require you that you know the IP address of where the machine that the IDE is running on. In which cases can be kind of annoying, especially if you have a development server that you use with multiple users. Then all of them are going to have a different IP address because they work from their own machines, right? And then having to configure a specific one, that means one of your coworkers is going to be very unfortunate because they have to debug all of the things that you want to do, which is not great. So if you're in a multi-user environment, what I actually recommend to do is that the first two things are the same. But instead of setting the remote host, I'm setting remote connect back. And what that does is actually it looks in the HTTP request where what the IP address is, where the HTTP request came from, and uses that to make the connection. So the HTTP request comes in, and in the headers you can figure out that it is from IP address 10.0.1.42. Then Xdebug sees, oh, this is being set. We make a DBGP connect to the IDE because I know which IP address that belongs to, because it assumes that the web browser runs on the same location as the IDE, on the same IP address, on the same machine. That isn't always necessarily the case, but that is the usual case. And then you do the communication and the HTTP response, right? So this is how the communication protocol works. It is not very simple. But it is sort of necessary that it works this way. Now, well, when you get Docker in the way, I specifically say getting Docker in the way because Docker creates its own network, and the IP address that the IDE uses to connect is not the one that matches with the IP address that you can use from within the Docker container where PHP, FPM, and Xdebug run to connect to your IDE. So that trick doesn't work anymore. So in these cases, you need to set the remote host again with the right IP address or this. What they use Docker for Mac or something. They have a specific pseudo thing. I don't know what is popping. I'm just going to turn it off. Bye-bye. So that makes these things kind of tricky to do. Go back to my normal size. Ooh. If it's too small, we can make it bigger again. All right, so these are the settings that are on the Xdebug side, right? You have the remote enable to turn it on, remote host and remote port, or you have the remote connect back and the remote port. I always advise people that use this. Now, if you're on the command line, some people want to check out Xdebug, well, like I did in my demo, right? I ran the PHP script on the command line. You need to make this this configuration setting, this very cryptic mentioned environment variable, which I can sometimes not even remember myself. So I want to improve that as well to make that, say, export Xdebug on or something like that, so that is better than setting your IDE key, because IDEs basically ignore anyway, so why is it there? There's a good reason for it, but I'm not going to have enough time to talk about that. All right, so something that I recently added is a way of actually finding out any issues with connectivity issues when Xdebug is trying to talk to your IDE. And this is setting is called remote_log. That is one that is definitely not going away because it's so useful. And it logs all the debugger communication, and it also logs connection attempts. So it will tell you, well, in the first example here, so we have set remote connect is back as 0, remote host is not here, like it doesn't exist, and the remote port is 9002. So when it starts connecting to it, it says, well, it wants to connect to this configured address and port, and then it says can't connect because the not here host doesn't exist. If you set connect back 1, well, it will try to figure out checking the remote connect back address, which it can do from your HTTP headers. And then it figures out that, well, the not here is the host I used in this case. It's still not here, so we still can't connect, right? And it will, in some cases, if you have proxy headers in between, it will also analyze those to figure out the exact IP address, where it comes from. But it will tell you exactly what doesn't work. If there's a connection timeout, it will tell you there's a connection timeout. So you need to raise a connection timeout or get a better network. I've had people ask me, so I have this developer in Australia, and anytime he wants to do any debugging, the connection always times out. Yes, they are in Australia and you're in Germany. The network isn't particularly very fast, right? So there are settings there that you need to make as well, but your remote debug log will tell you exactly what's going on there, which is very, very useful for debugging anything related to the debugger itself. So if you find bugs in Xdebug's debugger, the first thing I will ask you is for this log, because it will tell me exactly what the IDE sent, which breakpoints they set, and which returns are being made on the protocol. So very, very useful for me and also for you because you can debug connectivity issues. All right, so let's, still too big. Let's go at a sample set of people whining on Twitter. Because whining on Twitter is so much more useful than sending in bug reports. Not really. I love bug reports, good bug reports, not the ones that say it doesn't work. I unfortunately get these as well. But when you get people on Twitter, I search for Xdebug slow in this case. There's lots of other reasons why people complain about Xdebug, but this is a particularly interesting one. So people complain that code coverage is slow, or that other things are slow when Xdebug is loaded. And that makes sense because you install the debugger, and debugger does lots of things. And that is not done for free in an alternate universe where time doesn't take time, right? But there is an argument saying that, well, Xdebug tries to do too many things at the same time. Like the code coverage is always turned on by default, and you don't need the code coverage turned on as well as the little debugging help, like the stack traces or anything like that, right? You don't need those at the same time, because if you run a code coverage, you're not really expecting stack traces rendered in nice, I use the word nice, orange boxes on your screen, right? You don't need these things. But they still take time and they will take overhead. Like anytime you call a function in PHP with Xdebug loaded, what it does, it renders internally the whole function name. But also if you have turned it on, it will also create a string copy of all the variable information that you send to these functions. That takes time. Sometimes it can take quite a lot of time. But it needs to do that, otherwise you don't get a nice stack traces with the information that you expect. But it currently also does this if you run a profiler, or if you run the step debugger, or if you run the trace or anything like that. So all these things are very much intertwined, and that is because Xdebug is 17 years old and it's a little bit spaghetti-ish, which I think is a fair thing to say in Italy. I love spaghetti, but I don't like spaghetti code. All right, so another thing is I check with a lot of PHP versions. I also still do PHP 7.0, although I don't really support it anymore. It's 145 about. It could be one more, two more, because new PHP versions get released, right? And I need to make sure that it works on all of these PHP versions in both normal 64-bit mode, in 32-bit mode, in ZTS mode, which is a thread-safe version of PHP. And I need to check all of these also with opcache on and opcache off, because internally they generate different code for PHP, which Xdebug needs to look into. Now, you all run continuous integration for something, right? So if you run continuous integration for this configuration set, how long is that going to take? Well, doing one run, say on Travis, takes about 3.5 minutes for Xdebug, which is where Xdebug gets built and all the tests are run. And it doesn't even do all the remote debugging tests. So you have 3 times on Travis, you can run 4 or 5 of these at the same time. So you divide 150 divided by 5, that is 30. And 30 times 4 minutes is 2 hours. I don't want to wait 2 hours after I've made a commit, right? Especially when you're doing lots of pull requests, merging and stuff like that, then waiting 2 hours every single time where that works is not workable. So I need to come up with something better for this. So I've spoken a little bit about the problems. Now I want to talk a little bit about the solutions, because that's what you're all here for, hopefully. So the first thing I want to do, I want to set up a local CI, continuous integration, that's the word I was looking for. And what I also want to do is check it against, not only against release versions of PHP, but also to PHP 7.4 and 8. PHP 7.4 and 8 are currently under development, and the internals change compared to PHP 7.3. And what I want to make sure that Xdebug can still work with newer versions even after they're being developed, so that whenever PHP 7.4 comes out, Xdebug is also ready to come out. I want to have that happen at the same time, or maybe prefer even Xdebug to come out a little bit early so people can check, both beta test Xdebug for me, but also they can move on to a new version of PHP when it comes out and still have all the debugging tools there. So I want to do that for that reason, and the other reason why I want to have this local CI is so I can make use of my big, heavy, noisy, heat-generating machine under my desk to run all these iterations of the PHP configuration, right? So my machine there has 48 cores, which is a whole lot better than 5. It's also a lot faster than Travis. So I can run all those 145 configurations. I don't always run them every single time, clearly, but it will take me about 13 minutes to do, which is a whole lot better than 2 hours. And I have control access over exactly what is installed in this environment, which on Travis CI sometimes makes it very difficult to debug things because its setup can be different from what you do at home, and you don't necessarily know what the problems there are. So that's what I want to do with CI. Then I want to do the big refactor project. Basically, I want to rip it all out and redo most of it, and that's going to take a lot of time. I want to work a little bit on education, have better docs on how the networking works with Docker and stuff like that, how Xdebug interacts with these things. And I want to then, when I've done all the refactoring, figure out, well, how can I actually make the algorithms that do all the things that Xdebug does better? And for all these things to be done, well, it's going to take a lot of time. Like, it's going to be months and months of work. And I do have to pay the bills. So how I'm going to solve that, I don't know yet. I'm talking to the people of the JetBrains people. They are helping me work on some features of Xdebug. I'll show you that in a moment. All right, so what's the plan? Xdebug 2.8 is going to be the next release that's coming out. And I only want to focus on a few small things, which is PHP 7.4 support, which is sort of halfway done, up to the point where, well, if things change in PHP 7.4, then I'll of course have to make more changes, but it's sort of halfway done. The local CI is done, but I haven't done the nightlies yet. And I want to improve the breakpoint behavior, which I have done. So I'll focus on that in a moment. And then for Xdebug 3, that's the release I want to come out after 2.8, potentially together with PHP 8, but maybe not necessarily. There shouldn't be a reason why I need to wait until PHP 8. Where I then I will introducing modes, I'll show you that in a moment, and want to simplify the configuration and validation, and then of course work on some performance improvements at the same time. All right, so let's have a look at Xdebug 2.8. So let's get back to this breakpoint behavior that I showed you in a previous demo. So what I've here now is I created a function called scope. So I'm rubbish coming up with demo names. And then in there, I have a function defined as a closure. So I have the function, basically what it does, it creates an array. It calls the closure by calling $func parentheses, and then in the main body of the script, I call scoped twice. Now, if you look at the code that PHP generates internally, it's the following thing. So it says xnop, no operation. You get this X statement on line 4, which is the definition of the closure. Then you see an X statement on line 12, which is the calling of the closure, and line 13. So that is the scope function. That's what it shows internally. And then in the closure itself, it does an X no operation, an X statement, and a return. What is missing here? It's quite obvious when you look at this. What does the closure do? It defines an array, right? Where is that? It's not there. It's very confusing. That is what Zen's opcache does for you. If it finds things that it decides it's useless code, we'll throw it away, which is lovely if you want to run your code faster. Because this $a, this variable, nothing is being done with it, right? It's not returned, it's not echoed, there's nothing being done with it, so why keep it there? It's just taking up nonsense things to do. So what opcache does, it removes that. And that is not great if you want to debug and want to introspect the contents of the variable a, because it simply no longer exists. So I noticed this when making this presentation, that something is missing here. However, after I turned opcache off, or turned its optimizations off, not necessarily turning opcache off, it will then include those assignments. Like, I don't quite actually know why, in the first case, it didn't actually do the assignment of the closure either. That only showed up when I turned opcache off. There must be some magic going on that I haven't figured out yet. And it also does then the assigning of the array by turning off the opcache. However, this does not solve my problem. If I set a breakpoint on line 7, there's still no line 7 anywhere. Sorry, if I set my breakpoint on line 6 still doesn't show up here, right? Although you sort of expect this is where the variable assignment happens. Now, this one I fixed, and I'll show you how I fixed that. Demo time. Go to number 7. All right, let me load the... I don't actually know how to change to a different tab. So I need to exit presentation mode, open the other one. There must be a better way for this. All right, so this is the... it's a note. Let's ignore the notes. Let's set a breakpoint on line 6, right? And I go to my command line. I need to... So if I do that without it being fixed, the following happens, right? It stops on the first line as you expect. You go run, and nothing stops again because this is done on a line where PHP doesn't think there's any code, as I previously showed you. But let me switch to the fixed version. When I now run it, what happens? Well, it stops at the first line again. And now when I run continue, ooh, it stops somewhere. Actually, I loaded the wrong file. It doesn't matter in this case. I'll show you the other one with the closure in a moment. Because I ran the wrong script on the command line. Okay, let me fix that. Let me fix that. Fix that. Debugging live demos is always fun, isn't it? Alright, so it stopped here on the first line. So when I run next now, what happens is that there's a new notification in the console. This is currently debugging information because I'm working with the people from PHPStorm to fix this. And what it actually says, it says that breakpoint with this ID is now resolved, and it now knows, oh, there's a different line associated with it. So what line does it think it is? It's line 12, which is the call to the closure. So what is actually happening underneath is that whenever a scope gets entered, like a function or a closure or a file, Xdebug will look at all the breakpoints that are being set and tries to figure out whether there's actually code associated with the line that people want to set a breakpoint in. So what happened now is we are in the function scope, which is between lines 2 and 13. The closure isn't defined yet, so it doesn't know, PHP doesn't know about this yet, right? So it can't do any resolving of line numbers in there. But what it does, it goes from the line that you've set, it goes down for a maximum of 10 lines to figure out where code actually exists, where Xdebug could break. And in this case, it realized, oh, it can break on line 12, because that's where there's this another X statement thing. So it can stop there, which is lovely. Of course, that is not what we wanted in this case, right? We didn't want it to stop on line 12, but at least it stops now and it doesn't run all the way to the end. Now, what happens if you press next again? Well, the closure now gets executed, and Xdebug now sees, oh, there's a new scope, a new function being called, so I can run the resolver again. And it will run the resolver now for the lines that the closure covers, which is lines 4 to 10. And as long as that is a smaller range than what it's previously done, it will then readjust the breakpoint. So now it says, well, the breakpoint, we finally figured out it's on line 7, which is what the correct one is. That's what we wanted to do. Now, if I press next again, you don't see any other notifications. It still stops on this line because it has now resolved, and it doesn't have to redo it because it found the smallest possible scope where it could set a breakpoint. If I skip now to the next line, it should know that the variable a is also set because Xdebug now also turns off sends opcache optimizations if you are doing debugging, which means you don't get those weird annoyances where my variable doesn't exist. How annoying is that? Anyway, so that's the thing I've been working on recently. This functionality is mostly done. What doesn't work yet is that if you're in a scope already and you add an extra breakpoint there, it doesn't rerun the resolver yet because it only does it when a new scope gets entered. So this is something I still need to work on, hence the not fully ready version of this. And that's why Xdebug 2.8 isn't one of the reasons it's not out yet. Does that make sense? Good new addition, right? It should fix a lot of issues where people think they set a breakpoint and then it doesn't actually stop, which is highly frustrating. I know that. Demo, I done that. All right, so just to have a quick overview of things that are still broken in PHP 7.4 and Xdebug, I fixed a few things where PHP internals, they just randomly change. And then Xdebug stops compiling. It's kind of annoying. So in this case, there are opcodes. Opcodes are internal ways of doing specific things in the virtual machines, like things like adding a trait and binding a trait. There was a specific instruction in the VM for that, but it's now been optimized out, so these don't exist anymore, which means Xdebug can't make use of them, so I need to make sure that they don't get compiled in. Or things like add interface is also rolled into the same mechanism, so that also disappears and things like that. And then there's other changes in the internals that I still need to address. It stops compiling because PHP itself changed. And there's sometimes that is easy to find out because people have been getting better at documenting what the changes in PHP itself are, mostly because I complain a lot about this and have done so for the past 10, 15 years. Whereas when I started doing Xdebug with PHP 4.3 a long, long time ago or so, there was no documentation of internals whatsoever. And that was a lot of hard work. Luckily now we are a lot better at documenting internals as well as the changes. So although it doesn't work yet, I know exactly what to do to make this work. Just haven't done so yet. All right, so the local continuous integration, I already mentioned that any cloud-based CI is way too slow. There's too many configurations. I actually want to test more I want to test more configurations than I already do now, because at the moment I only do 32-bit, 64-bit, and ZTS, but I don't do 32-bit and ZTS at the same time, and neither do I still test opcache on and opcache off, because it'd be so many versions that it takes too much time. What I hope to catch out with this, I hope to catch out very early on when PHP's internals make changes, so that so I catch these things very quickly, so the Xdebug's Git repository is always up to date with the latest of PHP, which should be hopeful. And then I have the visualization I sort of written, but then it stopped working. We can talk about it at some other point. So this is what I'm still working on, not quite done yet. But then Xdebug 3. So what do I want to do there? I've already alluded to some of that. So the code organization is kind of, it's not organized whatsoever. It has random functions and random files, and there's a whole bunch of them, and it's really annoying because all of them start with Xdebug underscore, which is really annoying for auto-completion in IDs, or in my case Vim. So I want to change that. I want to do all the things that belong together, be in one specific directory, so that the different parts don't really need data from the other parts. I want to separate those things out more. What some people suggested is that instead of having one Xdebug extension, there should be an Xdebug profile extension, an Xdebug code cover extension, and so on and so on. I think that's a little bit too annoying for people to use, because they need to change internally not only different extensions, not only different settings, but also changing out extensions for things like that. And I don't really want to do that, so I don't think I'll do that. But I want to organize the code like it was like that. So in addition to that, I want to introduce modes. So a mode, what I mean is, well, you either turn Xdebug into the debug mode. So this is the mode that you'd use during your normal things, where you get your nice stack traces and your nice orange boxes and all the other settings that belong to that. So that's B1 mode. And another mode would be the step debugger. And the intention is that you can't have more than one of these modes on at the same time, with probably the exception of having the step debugger in combination with the normal debugging tools that Xdebug provides. Because that sort of makes sense, right? You're developing and so on and so on. What you don't really want to turn on is the step debugger and the tracer. The tracer functionality in Xdebug is a way of you for dumping all the function calls with all the variables, all the return state, all the return values, all to a big file, which is really, really useful for figuring out, with a new code base, exactly what codes what and what the code flow is and things like this. And I want to do something more special with this. We'll get back to that in a few slides. You also don't want to have the profiler turned on at the same time when you're doing the step debugger, because that clearly makes no sense to do. And then have a mode for the code coverage, where it's optimized for running your code coverage really quickly without having to do all the extra work for creating the stack traces. And then I want to implement a time traveler. I know it's a wizard. I couldn't find Doctor Who in my emoji set, so you got a wizard. So the intention, what I'd like to do is that the step debugger is very useful for code that you're currently running. The tracer is really useful for seeing what exactly has happened to all the variables. But what you can't do is debug an application that is already finished and go back in time. So like the step debugger, there's no back button, right? It's a very difficult thing to do in PHP, because, well, a function call could write things to a file. And how do you unwrite things to a file? Or more complicated, you insert something in a database. How do you do an uninsert in a database? It's something you can't really do, right? In functions in PHP, they almost always change some other state. And because of that, you can't really, while the script is being run, go back in time, because it just makes no sense. And PHP's virtual machine also can't really deal with that very well either. But what is possible is to record every state that is being run at the whole duration of your application or your script, because that is something that the tracer already does. But the step that is missing is converting these trace files back into a pseudo-running script that you then also go back into, because it wouldn't actually make the changes. It just contains the state of all the variables and all the functions that are being called. so that you can debug things that has already happened in the past. And I think if you have an application that you send out to other say customers to use, you can ask them for this trace file or this time travel trace file thing that I haven't written yet. Move it to your local machine, and it will have everything in there for you to debug things on your local machine, including going backwards or have a slider to go to different stages of your application. That's something I really would like to work on. Whole lot of work though. Several months at least, I would say. But it'd be great to have, right? All right. So configuration settings, I've already showed you that. This is the ones we currently have in Xdebug. And this is what I want to do with everything in red. I want to get rid of or replace with something else. Like the auto tracer, that should be renamed to trace auto start because that's where it belongs. It's just named stupidly. I don't want coverage enable or default enable or what is the other ones here? Profiler enable or remote enable, because I'm all going to fold this into this one setting where you can set the modes. I'm changing the names of most of the settings as well so that they include like debug, that's the debug helping tool, or what do I have here? Remote is for the step debugger, or profiler is the options for the profiler, so there's sort of namespace with an extra dot in here. I actually don't know whether PHP supports it internally, but if not, I'll hack my way around it at some point. I'm sure that's possible. I'm sure it works because I already have it with dump, so that should work. So the extended info is going to go away because I'm just going to always turn this on. All the things with output directories, all going to make the same one. IDE key is a setting as well. Going to get rid of it. Nobody uses it anyway, and so on and so on. And the scream option. Have any of you played with the scream option? Yes. I see thumbs here. But the scream option, the screen option does in Xdebug. It turns off the ampersand operator or the shut up operator, which means that you can't silence warnings, errors, and notices anymore. And I've been threatening for a long time to always turn it on Xdebug. It's a bad idea because sometimes you do need to silence your warnings and errors and notices and stuff like that. Show mem delta should always be on anyway, so I'm just going to turn it on. So these are the changes. I'm going to simplify this to make sure it is all easier. All right, so the performance things, that's going to be fixed after that. I have no specific plan for that. We'll see how much of an issue this is still after all the modes are separated out in Xdebug. And then I do this in my sort of spare time. I quit my job earlier this year. I had enough. And so I went back to doing contracting. And what I'd like to do is spend some of my time on Xdebug with some sponsorship from PHPStorm, hopefully with some of you. I started a Patreon account earlier in the year, no, last year. And quite a few people are giving me like $1 or $5 a month or something to, so that I can dedicate some of my work time to work on Xdebug. More of that, that'd be lovely. Similarly, something totally unrelated, I recently started a podcast that I wanted to pimp a little bit here. It's called PHP Internals News. There's now 9 episodes where I talk with other PHP Internals developers on all kinds of different things that are going on in developing the PHP language. If you're interested in hearing more of this, the podcast is available at phpinternals.news. It's about 15-20 minutes per episode, which should not be too long. Should be just long enough for your commute and stuff like that. Please go have a listen. And I'm very interested in hearing your comments on both the podcast, the presentation, Xdebug itself. I'm not very hard to find on the internet. You type my name with PHP. Should be easy. You can find me on Twitter, Derick R. Send me email at derick@xdebug.org. I'm very slow answering emails, but you'll always get an answer. With that said, thank you very much.